About the emergence of the first global era, and that is the era that's initiated by the European colonization of the Americas, and that is also caused by two big processes. One is the Colombian Exchange, and the second is the beginning of the first major system of world trade. Here are the video goals. Be able to answer these questions. So first, let's talk about what we mean by a global era. Before Columbus, the world was regional. That means that the world was divided up into more or less isolated and diverse human societies. That is, the people in Europe and the people in Asia and the people in America did not really interact with each other that much. There was a little bit of interaction between Europe and Asia, but it was really very limited. Next, there was very limited and non-existent trade between these groups. So there was no trade at all between America and Europe, and there was only very limited trade going on between Europe and Asia. Just a tiny bit of very precious things were exchanged, but most stuff stayed wherever it was made. And finally, there were very diverse biospheres. So every different group of people in these different areas is growing different animals and is dependent on different crops for their survival. After Columbus, the world becomes increasingly global. Human societies become less and less isolated and start to mix and become homogeneous. That means the same. And you can see this today by the fact that almost half of the world speaks just 9 languages. Also, trade between these groups begins to rapidly expand. There's more and more exchange of goods between these different areas. And finally, the biosphere becomes increasingly homogeneous. That means that most regions grow the same crops. This process through which human civilization becomes more and more global is known as globalization, and this process is still going on today. The main thing that makes this process possible is better technology. As transportation and communication get better, natural barriers like oceans and deserts and just plain distance become less and less significant. And this makes global trade and also global empire easier and more profitable. And you can see there that picture, that tiny little globe. That's the idea that basically the world is shrinking simply because it's getting easier for us to cross vast distances and to communicate more quickly with one another. It's as if the distance between different places is growing smaller. Main global phenomenon that happens because of contact between Europe and America. And this is the Colombian Exchange, named after Columbus, who starts the whole thing. And so the Colombian Exchange is a process of biological homogenization that takes place after contact between the American and the Eurasian civilizations. Homogenization, again, just means that the two biospheres are becoming more similar. All of the different plant and animal and disease species that live on these two continents are mixing together and making one similar biosphere. Before 1492, the world had two totally isolated biospheres. There was one over in the Americas, and there was one over in Europe. And the species that lived on these continents had not mixed or come into contact with each other for millions of years, except for a few important exceptions, including people who were able to cross over into America during the Ice Age. So after 1492, Europeans begin to transfer important species of animals and plants and diseases across the Atlantic. And so there's a mixing here where the most important species on each side are taken over and take root on the other continent. And this has the effect of revolutionizing agriculture and society on both sides of the Atlantic. It also has positive and negative effects, which we're going to talk about in a second. So the first major impact of the Colombian Exchange was disease. And basically what happened here is that Europeans who came over to America brought with them a lot of terrible diseases that Native Americans had no immunity to because they had never encountered them before. Basically, Europeans had been living with these diseases for thousands of years, so they were used to them and their bodies were more capable of fighting them. But the Native Americans had no natural defense against these illnesses, and so they died as a result of these. The major ones were smallpox, measles, typhus, and the chickenpox. Yeah, so think of that. Even the chickenpox was a deadly disease, whereas here, now that we've been exposed to it for a while, we're all pretty much fine. So as a result of this mixture of diseases, what happens in the Americas is worse than the Black Death in Europe. Between 50% and 90% of all pre-Columbian Americans die as a result of this disease. In some places, 100% of the population is wiped out. The result of this is that many of the societies in the Americas are greatly weakened, even before they meet Europeans. So the diseases spread more quickly than the Spanish do. So as soon as Columbus lands, there's a wave of diseases unleashed, as Native Americans spread the diseases among themselves. And this causes a huge instability in these societies, as half to 90% of the populations there die. For example, it leads to instability in the Aztec and the Incan empires, making it easier for the Spanish to conquer those places. And it also leads to collapses of entire civilizations. For example, the Mississippian civilization collapsed entirely before it ever met a European settler. In exchange for all these terrible diseases, the Native Americans do have one gift for the Europeans, and that is syphilis. European sailors contract this disease from Native Americans and carry it back to all of the European ports, and before long, syphilis is raging through Europe. It's kind of a depressing slide we just got through. This one's a little bit better. Basically, all of the plants and animals that are exchanged via the Colombian Exchange are amazing and revolutionize farming on both sides of the ocean. The first main thing is that a lot of awesome plants go to Eurasia. These include stuff like potatoes, corn, beans, tomatoes, making pizza possible, sweet potatoes, cocoa, and chili peppers. Imagine how boring our diets would be without those things. And so the main thing that's important about these plants, especially corn and potatoes, is that these can be grown very easily and they produce a whole lot of food. Potatoes especially are super amazing plants. And basically, as soon as Europeans realize that it's okay to eat these, it leads to an explosion of population, because potatoes are super easy to grow, they don't require very good soil, and they provide an incredible amount of food per acre. Basically, if you have potatoes and an acre of land, you can support a family of people. This leads to a rapid population rise in Europe, because there's a general rule in world history, and that is, if you have more food, you have more babies. This happens in Europe, and the population in Europe doubles over the next 200 years, mostly because of better food supply. On the other side of the Atlantic, there's a similarly important revolution going on in farming, but this revolution is happening mostly because of animals being brought over from Europe. So before the Colombian Exchange, the Americas did not have pigs, cows, sheep, or horses. And this is a big deal because animals are as crucial to agriculture as plants are. Horses make it easier to farm because they can pull plows, and they make it easier to travel. Pigs make cheap meat available, and basically pigs act as a edible disposal in farms, because you can feed pigs most of the waste products from whatever else you're growing and then have cheap meat on the side. And finally, all animals provide fertilizer, aka poop, which makes farming much more productive and easier. All you need to do is scoop the poop from your animals, spread it on your field, and you get more food than you would have otherwise. Effects of the Colombian Exchange. There is a short-term population decline in the Americas. This is the result mostly of the diseases that are introduced by Europeans. But in the long term, there is a huge increase in population in Eurasia because more food equals more babies. So if you look at this chart here, the black area represents the total human population, which stays pretty much stable for most of human history. But then, right around the time of the Colombian Exchange, we get to the inflection point in this process of exponential growth, and human population explodes from then on. And I'm not saying that this explosion of growth is totally due to the Colombian Exchange, but it is largely due to the better food supply that's made possible by this exchange. This big population boost, especially in Europe, allows for the colonization of the Americas. So most of the people in the Americas are wiped out by diseases and then by evil European people. But then there are plenty of Europeans being born who are eating corn and potatoes who then go over to the Americas and settle there. Another effect is that there is declining biodiversity. This basically means that there are a few major crops that replace all different regional agriculture. AKA, most of us now eat the same stuff. Most of us eat wheat, potatoes, and corn, and stuff that we feed those things to, like cows. This means that only the most efficient crops are being grown, which is good for feeding lots of people, but it also leads to a possible risk of famine. For example, this happened in Ireland, where almost everybody depended simply on one species of potatoes. All right, so let's move on now to talk about the next big global phenomenon, and that is the beginning of world trade. And this is made possible by the riches of the New World. So Europe had already reached Asia. You know, Vasco da Gama got to India and stuff. Hooray! But this was not really that big of a deal for a while because Asian societies only wanted gold and silver in exchange for their trade goods. Basically, the Europeans couldn't make anything that the people in India and China actually wanted. That meant that the only thing we had to trade was gold and silver. This at first was impossible to do at any large scale because Europe had very little precious metal. So even though we had the trade routes, we didn't really have anything to trade. But this all changes because of the Spanish colonies. Because in the Spanish colonies in South America, huge amounts of silver are discovered. And this silver allows the Europeans to have something that they can actually trade to Asia. The most famous site for silver mining in the New World was the mountain of Potosi, also called Cerro de Potosi. And it was also known as the Silver Mountain. And this one mine in South America produced over 41,000 tons of silver. And so these silver mines in South America provide incredible riches to Spain, but also provide all the silver that Europe needs to trade with Asia. So the Spanish silver makes its way back to Europe in exchange for manufactured goods that Europeans send to America. And this helps European cities to grow. Then this silver in Europe is carried by European traders to Asia, where they trade for good stuff like spices and silk and tea and other awesome things. Of world trade looked like in 1550, all made possible by silver in the New World. Spanish silver makes its way to Europe in exchange for manufactured goods. That's step one. Step two, European traders carry much of this silver to India and China. That's step two, that orange one around India. Step three, traders return with Asian products, stuff like tea and silk and spices. And they sell those things in Europe for more Spanish silver and then repeat the process. And they get richer and richer every time the cycle repeats. Meanwhile, while this is all happening, European cities are growing as trade and manufacturing expands. As more trade happens, more people can live in the cities, and so on and so forth. Also, European governments are able to become incredibly rich because they can tax this trade. And so as this trade expands, they get more and more money, which allows them to pay for greater and greater centralization. All right, so let's take a minute to look at the main results of all of this increasing globalization. Together, the Colombian Exchange and the new system of global trade have the following effects. There are 6. 1, the European population explodes, growing from 73 million in 1492 to 111 million by 1700. The population of the Americas collapses, going from 1492, 41 million to 13 million in 1700. 3, Europe becomes central in world trade. Now Europe has something that the rest of the world wants, and it can connect up with the rest of the world. And so this allows Europe to become much richer than it was before. 4, European cities expand. Europe becomes more urban than it was before. 5, European governments become more powerful because they can tax all of this trade that is happening. And 6, there is continually increasing globalization. As this trade continues, it becomes more and more intense. More and more people get involved in trading and manufacturing. And this process that started in 1492 is still going on today. And some people say it's going faster and faster as more and more technologies are invented. So really, we can thank the Spanish colonization of the Americas for kicking off the modern era of globalized trade and globalized culture. Make sure you can answer these questions. Also, one thing I'd like for you guys to think about is, was globalization a good thing? Is it worth it? We have more stuff, we have more people, but what have we lost in exchange? Good night.